Welcome back to session 7. It's my pleasure to introduce the chair for this session, Mark Winfield. Mark is a professor in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University, where he also serves as a co-chair of the Sustainable Energy Initiative and coordinator of the Joint Master of Environmental Studies Juris Doctor program. He is the co-editor of the book Sustainable Energy Transition in Canada and recently joined the EMH Executive Committee. Mark will moderate the session on sustainability consideration in energy transition. Please join me in welcoming Mark and his panelists to the stage.
Thanks, Edouard. I'm actually going to begin with a little plug, just to mention that the call for papers for the Ontario Network on Sustainable Energy Policies annual workshop is out. That'll be May 5th and 6th at Queen's. And this year we're actually presenting the workshop in partnership with EMH. So I would encourage you, if you are working on things, if you have graduate students who are working on things that we would like to present, please consider putting in a proposal for a presentation. And we're not looking for complete papers at ONCEP. We're really looking for what could be working papers, work in progress. And I know there's a healthy group of ONCEP alum in the EMH network. What we're going to focus on today, or in this session, is sustainability considerations in modeling energy systems transitions. I was just thinking we had an excellent segue from the previous panel where we left off, which was in a sense precisely raising these sorts of questions around non-carbon, non-energy dimensions of sustainability. And indeed, we had hints of that yesterday as well in discussions around biofuels and hydrogen. In all of these cases, we sort of need to keep in mind that energy transitions involve more than just energy and GHG KPIs. And so we do need to consider wider sustainability aspects of these issues. Sometimes need to remind people that affordable and clean energy and climate action are actually only 2 of the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So we do need to be sensitive to carbon and non-carbon trade-offs in the energy space, and in particular to pay attention to the upstream and downstream aspects of fuel and material cycles, which we have tended partially because it was the nature of the mandates which have been given to modelers to sometimes overlook in these conversations. It was very interesting to see them sort of coming back into the conversation in the previous panel. In thinking about this, we chose to focus this conversation on 2 areas, one around nuclear energy and the other around critical minerals. And we chose these because they are, from a modeling perspective, difficult to model and assess. There are high levels of uncertainty, and there are disagreements among well-informed people around technological and economic assumptions and viabilities around certain pathways. So these do present some challenges in terms of energy transition modeling. To help us think about this, we have 4 speakers. Our first speaker will be M.V. Ramana, who is the Simmons Chair in Disarmament, Global and Human Security, and professor at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of British Columbia, who's going to be talking about economic and sustainability aspects of nuclear energy. He is one of the contributors to the annual World Nuclear Industry Status Report and is also a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and the Leo Szilard Award from the American Physical Society. We'll then hear from Jim McKenzie, Jamie Keenan, and Sudeshna Mohanty, who is going to be joining us remotely from the Rocky Mountain Institute. So, Ramana, thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Edward, for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. As Mark said, we are here to talk a little bit about sustainability considerations, but I'm going to focus my talk primarily not so much on the upfront and the downstream aspects, but on trying to make an argument for making realistic assumptions about nuclear energy and when modeling. What I've noticed in general is that to the extent that energy models involve nuclear energy in climate mitigation, they tend to make extremely optimistic assumptions. And I think that's reasonable in one way, because if you make realistic assumptions, the models will probably not pick nuclear energy. But at the same time, that's not a good reason to keep modeling it with unrealistic parameters. So that's basically what I'm going to be talking about. I do have a position on what I think nuclear energy should be and not be, but that's not what I'm going to talk about. For those who are interested, I'll make a plug for my book. There's a book which I wrote earlier this year, which came out this year, called Nuclear is Not the Solution, The Folly of Atomic Power. But that's not what I'm going to talk about. But a lot of the numbers that I'm talking about are sort of sitting in that book as well, where if you want to go and look into that later. Okay. So to start with, what's the global picture about nuclear energy? The best days of nuclear construction are over nearly more than, about 40 years ago nearly. So the maximum number of nuclear power plants that were linked to the grid, the peak was in 1984 and 1985. Since then, it has fallen very sharply. If you look at the dates there, you can kind of see that the first year when the drop started coincides with the year when the Chernobyl reactor exploded in the former Soviet Union in 1986. Since then, there have been many years when more nuclear reactors have been shut down than added to the grid. The result of this very slow construction process is that the share of global electricity flowing in the grids from nuclear power plants has been declining consistently since the mid-1990s. It used to be about 17.5%. It's now barely over 9%. And most projections look at this share falling even further in the future. In contrast, the share of modern renewables, primarily wind and solar, has been increasing pretty rapidly. I think it was about 16% in 2023, up from about 1% in the mid-1990s. And the primary reason for this is that nuclear power is one of the most expensive ways of generating electricity. If you were to build a new nuclear power plant, this is the estimate from the United States by Lazard, which is a Wall Street company. It's been trying to track what its projections for different sources of energy. And what you see is that nuclear energy is sort of the curve on the top and the right. And that's sort of the two things to note. One is that it's the highest. The second is that as the construction of the first nuclear plant in the United States after a very long time proceeded, the costs kept increasing. So in contrast, the cost of wind and solar have been falling very rapidly. If you look at some of these recent projects that are under construction or have been constructed, these are the costs for the three big projects in Western Europe or in the United States that are either under construction or have been constructed. And of these, the costs have all been in the tens of billions of dollars. The only one that is actually completed here is the last one, the Vogtle plant in the United States. The Vogtle plant cost roughly around $37 billion. We're still counting what the total costs are going to be. And if you just took not the overnight construction cost, but this as a per kilowatt cost, that translates to over $16,000 per kilowatt. And that's roughly comparable with the current estimates for the cost of the Hinkley Point C plant in the United Kingdom. These are two EPR reactors being constructed by EDF, the French company. And EDF's other construction project right now is in France itself, the Flamanville project. That has also been quite expensive, but not nearly as expensive as these two other reactors. The other thing to note about nuclear construction is that it's a very long process with much uncertainty about how long it is going to take. So these are all of the plants that have been constructed and been connected to the grid in the last 10 years. This is part of, Mark mentioned that I contribute to an annual report called the World Nuclear Industry Status Report, we try to track this every year in whatever is happening in the nuclear construction field. And what you see is that the average construction time, that is the time between you start pouring concrete into the ground to the point where the reactor is connected to the grid, is about 10 years. Okay? There are some which are lower. Those tend to be in countries like China, where they do things slightly differently from elsewhere. And the maximum construction periods can be quite long, and there's much uncertainty here. There's a long history of cost and time overruns in nuclear power plant construction. The one academic paper that examined about 180 projects found that 175 of them exceeded their initial budget and also the time that was projected for them to be constructed. And the most recent project that I mentioned earlier that's come online in the United States, the Vogtle project, it cost about $37 billion, as I said, but $37 billion was up from $14 billion, that was the cost estimate when construction started. And that $14 billion itself was actually higher, about 3 times what was initially estimated when the Energy Policy Act of 2005 under the George Bush administration was passed. That was the time, that was the government order that gave a lot of incentives to energy companies to invest in nuclear power. So at that time, Westinghouse, the company that was making, that designed the AP1000 reactor, as well as the Nuclear Energy Institute and other nuclear advocates, were anticipating that 2 of these AP1000 reactors would cost something like $5 to $6 billion. So that went up to $14 billion by the time construction started, and then the $14 billion went up to $37 billion by the time the construction was over. So, and this is the most recent one, so this is after all of the experience we've had with lots and lots of nuclear reactors. The claim the nuclear industry makes is that these are all problems of old reactor designs. There's now a new generation of nuclear reactor designs that is going to change these trends. These new reactors go under different names: advanced reactors, generation 4 reactors, and most often small modular reactors. I'll cut to the chase. I don't think small modular reactors are going to fix the problem. The reason is that there are 4 major challenges that even nuclear advocates would admit to for nuclear power. So I'm quoting, for example, the 2003 study by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology called The Future of Nuclear Power, where they explicitly pointed out there are 4 major challenges. One that I've already talked about a lot is the problem of cost. And the second problem is that nuclear reactors are capable of severe accidents. And the third is that they produce radioactive waste for which there is no demonstrated solution anywhere. And fourth, there is the linkage between nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. The same technology that allows you to produce nuclear energy will get you some of the way towards making nuclear weapons as well. It becomes a matter of intention whether a country that acquires nuclear power capacity decides to go ahead and try to use some of that capacity to make nuclear weapons or not. But in terms of the capability itself, having a nuclear energy program helps you somewhat. Now, there are different kinds of reactor designs that try to address each of these challenges. But what happens is that if you were to try to figure out what you need to put into the design in order to deal with one of these. For example, if you wanted to reduce the amount of radioactive waste that you produce, you would have to design a reactor that operates in what's called the fast spectrum, where the neutrons are not slowed down. And if you go into the fast spectrum, that automatically means that you have to have a much higher content of fissile material in the core that leads to certain kinds of accidents which are not possible in other kinds of moderated reactors, in particular so-called core disassembly accidents. And also because of the higher quantities of fissile material, that makes it more proliferation prone. So there's always going to be trade-offs. And if you want to try to do one better, then you're going to almost automatically do another thing bad. In particular, when you go to smaller reactors, you lose out on what are called economies of scale. So the cost of building a reactor that produces 5 times as much power would not be 5 times as much as a smaller reactor, although the amount of electricity you'll be generating and therefore the amount of revenue that a company would get would be 5 times as large. And this is simply because you don't need 5 times as much concrete in a larger reactor or 5 times as many workers. So there are these economies of scale, which are well known in all engineering challenges. And this is the reason why the nuclear industry, which initially started building small reactors all over the world, whether it's in Canada or in the United States or in India, has always tried to move to larger and larger reactors because they're trying to take advantage of these economies of scale. And so when you go back to small reactors, you're going to lose out on those economies of scale. And the same will also mean that you're going to be producing more spent fuel or waste because a smaller reactor will automatically lead to more neutrons being escaping out into the environment simply because of the smaller surface to volume ratio. Largest surface to volume ratio. And you can try to compensate for it by adding blanket elements and so on, which are going to increase the amount of waste in other ways. Anyway, so the point is that there are going to be trade-offs. And in particular, even though the total cost of a smaller reactor is going to be smaller, the per kilowatt cost is higher, means that your also electricity prices are going to be higher. The other sort of arguments that you might hear about how the nuclear designers are going to escape this problem is by saying, oh, we can do mass manufacture and lower the cost. Now, there are sort of two problems there. The first is that historically, the costs of nuclear power plants have only increased, not decreased. So both in the United States and France, the plots here show the costs of nuclear plants as they were constructed. And these are the two countries with the most number of nuclear reactors. And so if you see this sort of trend, you have to see this sort of reality to it. And what is more important is that the most recent reactors that have been constructed in these countries, France and the United States, have been the most expensive. So there is some reason to be skeptical about the idea that learning is going to bring down cost. And the second is, even if you were to assume that there is going to be learning, the number of loss leaders that would have to be built would be extremely large. I see I'm out of time, so I'm going to sort of run quickly. I'll just say that this loss of economies of scale is being borne out in the construction projects or the cost estimates we have seen. So there is one SMR being constructed in the West, in Argentina. The current, we don't know whether it's been extremely delayed. Construction started in 2014. It was supposed to come online in 2017 to 2018. It's 2024 now. They're talking about 2027 or 2028. We don't know whether that's realistic. But the current cost estimates are in the order of about $17,000 per kilowatt. And the most advanced reactor design in the United States is the new scale design. That's the one that's closest to getting a Nuclear Regulatory Commission design approval. And that's the only project that was proposed. Collapsed in November of last year. This is the UAMPS project because the cost ran up to about $9.3 billion for 462 megawatts. And at that point, the people who were supposedly buying the power pulled out of the project. And so that cost estimate is also extremely, extremely high. Okay? And there's also a similar pattern of delays in terms of SMR construction. I won't go into the details here. So let's sort of just mention a couple of very quickly things. Construction cost of, I'm just going to make up a number, $15,000 per kilowatt. As I mentioned, there's a lot of uncertainty here, but I think the uncertainty is sort of more on the higher side than on the lower side. And I don't think that you should assume very rapid construction periods. And I don't think you should assume that, if you build large numbers of them, costs are going to go down. And I'll just say there are sort of a lot of uncertainty as well about life cycle cost. There's very little experience with decommissioning of old reactors. Typical cost estimates based on the few countries that have actually decommissioned reactors like Germany is that the cost estimates are about $5 to $12 per megawatt hour, there is no experience with long-term waste disposal. As I mentioned, there is no operating repository anywhere for spent fuel anywhere. So we don't really have a good cost estimate there. But the fact is that because these are all costs that are incurred decades and decades into the future, the contribution to the levelized cost is going to be small because any non-zero discount rate will mean that this is going to fall pretty fast. Okay. I'll also finally mention that all reactors are susceptible to accidents, and that's another source of uncertainty. It's captured very nicely in this comment by a former Nuclear Regulatory Commission commissioner saying that, the 3 Mile Island accident taught Wall Street that something which was treated as a big asset can quickly become a liability. And it's almost impossible to make sure that a nuclear reactor cannot have an accident simply because the nature of the technology is so complex. There are always things that can possibly go wrong. And then the cost of the accidents can be extremely high. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Roman. Covering a lot of space in a short time. We're going to change gears slightly and move more in the direction of critical minerals, although we see there's crossover between the two issues as well. Our next speaker is Jim McKenzie, who is a principal in the Office of the Auditor General's Performance Audit Practice. And in particular, he was the principal on the audit on the federal government's critical mineral strategies that was published actually just a couple of weeks ago, which again sort of pushed us in this direction. And effectively, Jim was the principal there, which makes him effectively the principal investigator in academic terms. I'm going to invite you to speak about the audit and the findings. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Mark. Hello, everyone. My name is Jim McKenzie. I'm a principal with the Office of the Auditor General of Canada. I'd first like to just say thank you to the organizers and to Mark for reaching out to our office and inviting us to participate in today's event. I'm here today, as Mark has mentioned and the slides indicate, to talk to you about our recent audit on the Canadian Critical Minerals Strategy. It was recently tabled in Parliament by the Commissioner of the Environment back in early November. What I'd like to do is just really give you a quick overview of the role of the Commissioner, select findings and recommendations from our report, and talk to you about a couple of our recommendations and concluding comments. So first, the role of the Commissioner. The Commissioner is part of the Office of the Auditor General. The role or the position of the Commissioner was created in the mid-1990s as a result of amendments that were made to the Auditor General Act. Really, the Commissioner undertakes several roles, primarily auditing federal programs related to the environment and sustainable development. So essentially looks at the environmental programs and sustainable development programs on behalf of the Auditor General, has a separate report, so the Auditor General tables their reports and the Commissioner has separate reports. We also, or the Commissioner also manages an environmental petitions process. And also I think what will be of interest is that the Commissioner, as a result of recent legislation, also reports on the government's implementation of climate change measures as part of the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act. The Commissioner has tabled 2 reports in relation to the Act. And the Commissioner also monitors implementation of the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy, which is part of the Federal Sustainable Development Act. As I say, the Commissioner has been around since about the mid-1990s and has been reporting on, I would say, quite a wide variety of issues over that time. So the Canadian Critical Minerals Strategy, just to give you some background, some context, it was released in late 2022. It has a vision of increasing the supply of responsibly sourced critical minerals and supporting the development of domestic and global value chains in support of the green and digital economy. It has 5 objectives, as you can see on the slide here. And the two that are shaded are, and I'll get into that a little bit in the next couple of slides, are the areas that we focused on. So specifically, the objectives related to advancing reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and promoting climate action and environmental protection. And I would note that other jurisdictions, including provinces and other countries such as the United States, Australia, and the European Union, have also released strategies aimed at increasing the supply of critical minerals and strengthening the security of both the supply of critical minerals themselves and related supply chains. So we recognize that the strategy was in its early stages of being implemented. So we examined the governance. We made a decision to look at the governance structure and how it was set up to oversee the implementation of the strategy. We looked at indicators used to track progress and how the risks to the strategy's environmental and Indigenous reconciliation objectives were being managed. We also looked at early actions or initial actions of the Critical Minerals Geoscience and Data Initiative. It's an interesting initiative. It's looking at developing a system, a GIS basically based system that overlays critical mineral potential or areas in Canada with critical mineral potential and associated environmental and social issues or aspects, if you will, as a means of helping to inform decisions and to help identify areas that have the potential for extracting critical minerals with the lowest environmental and social impacts. So I think an interesting initiative. And so why is it important? I think there's an inherent challenge in that increasing mining activities for critical minerals and related infrastructure, so roads, transmission lines, et cetera, could have an impact on Canada's 2050 commitments to achieve net zero emissions, but also Canada has made recent commitments around biodiversity, in particular to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. And so we saw that having a robust governance and risk management systems, if you will, or structures, are important for mitigating the risks that come with increased critical mineral activity and related infrastructure development. So I'll talk briefly about a couple of our findings, and then maybe I'd like to touch on some of the recommendations. First, we had one of our findings was that Natural Resources Canada, who's the lead department for the strategy, had not completed an analysis of the greenhouse gas emission or climate and environmental impacts to determine the implications of the Canadian Critical Minerals Strategy. We recognize that there are challenges and uncertainties in trying to estimate, for example, greenhouse gas emissions and environmental costs and benefits of increasing the supply of critical minerals. For example, the type and number of projects that will be coming on stream, including those that are supported by the federal government. There's certainly technological developments that will be occurring in the coming years, changes in market conditions, changes in demand, and also the use of circularity as a means of meeting demand. And I would also note that even the location of projects, so the number and type, but also the location of projects, for example, are they in carbon-rich areas that could have an implication from a greenhouse gas perspective. We also note, though, that there is historical information that exists. There are currently about 55 critical mineral mines active in Canada, 26 processing facilities, and about 190 projects that are advanced, if you will. They're not operating, but they're in the advanced stages. And Natural Resources Canada has also estimated that they're looking at probably 14 new mines and 19 processing plants to fulfill the needs of the new battery plants that are being constructed in Canada. So there's certainly information there as a starting point. We also found that there were incomplete indicators and targets to measure progress We did see that there were indicators and targets related to the economic reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, such as revenue sharing and job opportunities, but there were limited indicators with respect to the social aspects, such as improvements in community well-being and impacts on local living conditions and safety for communities and women. We also found that there were no indicators or targets related to cumulative environmental impacts or effects that could result from critical mining activities. And I'll touch on a couple of other items as I get into the next couple of slides. Let's talk about the recommendations. So the first recommendation really had three components, and it touches on what I was just covering about the lack of analysis related to the environmental impacts and the potential impacts on the net, the net benefits with respect to greenhouse gas emissions. So we had recommended that the department work with the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada and look at using regional or strategic assessments to assess the potential impact of increasing critical mineral activities across Canada. And in particular, it would help characterize environmental and social risks and impacts. And also work with relevant federal departments and agencies to complete an analysis of the greenhouse gas impacts, if you will, with respect to the strategy. What I would note is that regarding the greenhouse gas analysis, the response from Natural Resources Canada, I would say, is positive. They agreed to work with others, including federal and provincial partners, to examine and develop an appropriate methodology for a national level analysis of expected net impacts. And also emphasize, the analysis would emphasize a full life cycle approach to the analysis, and that would ensure downstream impacts are appropriately considered. So positive, certainly there's, as I had mentioned, there's uncertainties around this, but at least we'll have, there's an indication that they'll work towards developing a methodology. The other recommendation is really, or a couple of recommendations are really around improving the impacts, or sorry, the indicators, and working with other federal departments to look at the indicators and improve them, make them more complete. But also, so the first recommendation was around assessing and characterizing the risks and potential impacts. And another recommendation we have is around putting in place systems to monitor essentially those risks going forward. So again, the department agreed with both of those recommendations. I think, though, most importantly is just really some concluding remarks to try to bring it together and connect some of the dots. So overall, we see a need for that there needs to be more done to ensure that achieving the objectives of the strategy and the strategy's vision of increasing the supply of critical minerals is not done at the expense of other objectives and priorities of the government, of the federal government. So, for example, the Commissioner has referred to the analogy, the balloon analogy. So we're trying to avoid kind of squeezing one end of the balloon to achieve objectives associated with increasing the supply of critical minerals that could essentially have an impact on biodiversity, for example, or other environmental considerations. So squeezing the balloon at one end just really means that it's increasing pressures at the other end of the balloon or other commitments and objectives of the federal government. Just to note that we feel it's important to understand the full costs and benefits of increasing mining and including related infrastructure development. There's been a lot of talk about the fact that, you know, increasing the supply will potentially increase or lead to a need to go into more remote areas. So that's going to include providing access to those areas. So again, it has a biodiversity and a nature-related implications, not necessarily on the greenhouse gas side, but certainly has implications and potentially impacts on the government's commitment to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. Also, as the strategy notes, critical minerals are used for things like electric vehicles, solar panels, but they're also used in other applications, whether it's defense, military applications, household products that do not necessarily have the same environmental benefits. And so therefore, looking at that broader picture of not just the use of critical minerals for EVs, but looking at what impacts is it going to have more broadly. And I think that that's important because ultimately, at the end of the day, there are going to be trade-offs and choices that will have to be made. And the better that the more we understand in terms of what those trade-offs are, will help inform decisions. And also, I think will also inform local communities, often who are, there's a lot of talk about social acceptance, things of that nature. So having better information can help inform those discussions and dialogue amongst the various parties that will be affected. And maybe just as a last note, I would just say that there's a lot of focus on decarbonizing the mining sector and mining activities, certainly important. But as we note in our audit, that there are other adverse and cumulative environmental effects that also need to be considered, so that we're looking at, again, a full picture. So that's my concluding remarks. The report is available on our website, listed there on the last slide. So again, thank you, and thank you, Mark, and to the organizers. I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim. Our next speaker, and we've sort of tried to construct a kind of narrative arc here, particularly around the critical minerals question, that we have this as Jim was laying out, that the strategy has perhaps not considered fully both the carbon and non-carbon dimensions of this pathway. And we'll have Jamie Neen, who's our next speaker, perhaps speak a bit more about the specifics of the environmental impacts, the impacts on reconciliation that flow from that pathway. And then the sort of third part of our arc was Shana's work, with Rocky Mountain Institute, which is sort of looking at, well, are there ways out of, is there pathways out of this apparent negative trade-off space, and what might those look like? Jamie Neen is the outreach coordinator and Canada program lead with Mining Watch Canada, and there he works on mining policy advocacy and mining activity in Western and Northern Canada, working on policy reform, and also providing strategic and technical support to the communities that are affected by mineral exploration and mining projects. Jamie, welcome.
Thank you, Mark, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to start with just a few words about what Mining Watch is, just for setting the stage a bit. We are a small nonprofit working across Canada and internationally to try and address the impacts of the mining industry. Kind of says what it means on the tin. And what we're trying to do and where we're working is essentially between policy and reality. So working with communities affected by mining, working on the direct impacts of mining projects, from the exploration through to closure and abandonment, and looking at the impacts of the Canadian industry's engagement around the world, and trying to bring that into the policy world to change the rules that make these problems that we're encountering continue to be propagated. So I'm wanting to address, building on the critical minerals discussion, but the broader material implications of the low carbon energy transition. And basically because, and you got a sense of that out of Jim's presentation, that a lot of the actual upstream implications of energy transition are not part of the discussion, they're not part of the policy making that goes on. And from our perspective, trying to bring the reality of what those developments mean, what supplying those needs means into decision making means going upstream, looking at where these materials come from, what the demands are, and how they're being addressed. Because energy doesn't come from nowhere. Renewable energy doesn't require fossil fuels, obviously, but it does require massive amounts of metals and other materials like graphite to make it happen. And for example, the World Bank a few years ago estimated that the demand for copper, so for everything from turbine and engine windings to transmission lines and electronics, would have to go up by a factor of up to 8. And that would mean that over the next 25 years, we would need to mine as much copper as the world has mined in the last 5,000 years. A little bit sobering. And again, the issue is not abstract because these things come from somewhere. And as Jim mentioned, the mining industry is expanding. Ore grades are decreasing as the most easily accessible ores are mined out. And that means that remote areas, delicate ecosystems, indigenous territories are increasingly under pressure from increasingly large mines with increasingly large impacts. The argument has been made that this is not important because the massive amounts of fossil fuels that we're taking out of circulation make it worth whatever the cost is for the materials to build the energy transition. There's two problems with that. One is that the amount of toxic waste generated by the mining industry is not factored into that. And, I haven't seen any serious work on this, but just a little, back of the envelope calculations on the, extraction rates and so on says that the amount of waste produced by mining can approach the amount of fossil fuel being extracted. And if you think about it, ore grades for a lot of metal mines are well under 1%, and what we're doing is creating billions of tons of mine waste on the surface for generations to come to deal with. And the other is simply that I was taught that two wrongs don't make a right. Breaking a few eggs to make an omelet is fine if you're not the egg. And the problem is that we're actually trying to resolve all of these issues, and we'll come back to this because it is a multidimensional problem. It's not simply a matter of CO2 or greenhouse gases more broadly and energy. It's a matter of the sustainability of not the planet, but at least of human civilization. And I don't think that's an understatement, given the kinds of situations that we're increasingly seeing. And again, the problem that the impacts of mining on all of these dimensions are not included in the policy making around energy and material use. And they're not just theoretical problems, they're actual practical limits, I think, to how far the energy transition can go without taking these things into consideration. So in other words, we can't simply mine 8 times as much copper. It's not actually possible to do that in the time frame of the next few decades when it is in demand. Therefore, other policy alternatives need to be explored and implemented. There are other kinds of uncertainty within this. So, the technological pathways are not well established. Some things are fairly stable. Let's say turbine and engine technology is developing, but it's not radically changing. But especially when you come to things like battery technology, it's highly flexible. The markets have a really hard time addressing this because we don't know what the demand for specific minerals will be within the space of 5 to 10 years. In other words, within the time frame needed to develop a mining project and get materials to market, or at least to processing, creates a real contradiction. So we haven't really seen governments and policy trying to address this directly. We've seen, in Ontario, we've seen massive investments in Quebec as well in, lithium-ion manufacturing, and they're already starting to go sideways as the investors pull out. The market for lithium has shifted. The market for nickel has shifted, all of the components. So there are other technologies that are emerging, demand is shifting and so on. So it's a very difficult area to make projections in. And then there's other changes that may be incremental in nature, but then become disruptive. So, looking at what's happened with photovoltaics and the reaching a cost point where suddenly, it's something that happened not very slowly, but incrementally, and then all of a sudden, photovoltaics are cheaper than any other form of electricity. Looking at the policy implications, the problem is that the considerations, and I think Jim's presentation hinted at this, that there's not really coherent policy considerations being put together here. I haven't had a chance to debate the commissioner's report and talk to them about this, but I think an obvious example is that Canada's energy policy is being siloed into different areas, and the critical minerals policy is given to Natural Resources Canada to develop and implement, absent any cross-linking with Indigenous concerns or with environmental concerns or with technology and science. So, the mandate is to mine more without any consideration of what for or how. Another way of looking at it is to look at transport, which gets a lot of attention because it's a big chunk of the greenhouse gas budget. But transportation policies directly affect resource demands, and so do preferences such as vehicle sizes. So the Climate Community Project at UC Davis did some really interesting work modeling just the US transportation systems and projections over the next few decades, and found that simply limiting the size of EV batteries could cut lithium demand by up to 42%. They were kind of stunned by how big that number was. We expected some variation, but it was quite profound. And then by decreasing car dependency, and moving into recycling, you can reduce that up to 92%. So, that gives you an indication of the ramifications of not simple, but I think fairly straightforward policy directions. And it needs to be said that electric cars, electric vehicles provide an environmental benefit only in relation to internal combustion engine vehicles. They're still cars. They still run on roads. They still produce. They still use tires and everything that implies. So, looking beyond that to the environmental and social impacts, I just wanted to touch on the sort of the life cycle sustainability aspects, the importance of including the source materials in any kind of discussion of how energy needs are going to be met, looking at the broader environmental and social considerations, so water, biodiversity, methane, carbon sinks, other land uses and livelihoods, and social impacts around displacement and consent, specifically for Indigenous peoples in their territories, and point to things like the economic benefits that are often unanalyzed in these discussions. So we have mining projects that have clear environmental impacts and could be disqualified for having significant environmental impacts, that this project will wipe out a specific caribou herd. We don't want that to happen, but it will provide jobs. And the jobs part of the equation, the economic benefits part of the equation, is never parsed out. And we've challenged it a number of times in project assessments and other processes. We're now seeing research coming out of British Columbia, for example, showing how weak those projections are, that the nature of the mining industry and the nature of individual projects is that those projections are wildly optimistic and really need to be challenged. I want to mention, again, looking at the life cycle aspects, that it's not just the upfront impacts on water systems, on communities, on biodiversity, it's also the rest of the mining cycle that needs to be considered. Mining produces, as I said, massive amounts of waste. This has to be managed for centuries, if not in some cases in perpetuity. There are still iron mines in Britain polluting waterways 1,000 years later. And looking at specifically the nuclear question, and picking up a bit on the earlier discussion, there's another dimension to that, which is the fuel, which is not carbon neutral. It takes a lot of energy to dig and process uranium into fissile material. And the operation and the waste management, again, of uranium mines is something quite significant and not factored in. So, in Ontario, we have 100 million tons of uranium mine tailings at Elliott Lake. There are another 100 million or so in northern Saskatchewan, but much higher radioactivity, that need to be essentially managed in perpetuity. And so this is all just an appeal to try and broaden all of the considerations in this discussion, to try and bring the externalities into the conversation, into the analysis, and I think importantly to understand these not just as considerations, but in many cases as actual constraints on how far any policy can be implemented and what the end results will be. So with that, I will conclude. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jamie. Our final speaker is Sudeshna Mohanty, who is a senior associate in the Carbon-Free Transportation Team and a core member of the Rocky Mountain Institute's Battery Circular Economy Initiative, since this is an attempt to find ways out of some of the trade-off dilemmas that Jamie in particular was highlighting around EV supply chains, and in particular to look at the potential role of circularity in supporting growing EV demand in a way that is responsible and resilient. Sudeshna, you're all set? We're all set to go? Very good. Okay, thank you. Have we got audio?
Yeah. And can you see my screen?
Yes.
Awesome. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Sudeshna Mohanty. I'm a senior associate at RMI. And I want to thank my panelists for teeing up my presentation, which is about building comprehensive analysis around EV battery mineral demand and strategies on how we can meet this demand efficiently. And these analyses can inform decisions, policy decisions, investment decisions. This is the work that we do at RMI's Battery Circular Economy Initiative, which is focused on building circular EV battery supply chains that can support meeting the growing demand in an efficient and responsible manner. Okay. So this initiative is a part of the transportation team at RMI, one of the many teams that work to advance RMI's mission of decarbonizing energy production and use globally. We are a nonpartisan, philanthropically funded nonprofit, and we seek to inform decision makers through a data-led focus on efficiency, whole systems analysis, and leveraging business to drive change. To have an informed strategy around EV minerals, we expanded a traditional analysis by two ways. First, by considering a full spectrum of solutions that can help meet the growing EV demand. And second, by adding more impact metrics talking about the benefits of circularity. So I'll quickly go through the first part. We expect global battery demand to grow by 12 times from today through 2050. A simple linear outlook would mean that we need 12 times more critical minerals such as lithium, nickel, and cobalt in 2050. More mining, as you heard, raises a lot of concerns. First, the mining is often associated with environmental degradation and violations of human and indigenous rights. Second, mineral deposits tend to happen in a handful of countries, and that can put the entire supply chain at risk because of changing trade alliances, geopolitical tensions, weather events, pandemics, and whatnot. However, there are 6 alternatives to meeting this mineral demand, and these involve how we use materials with efficiency, we make them with innovation, and reuse them with circularity. The first 3 levers, changing battery, changing battery chemistries, improvements in energy density, and recycling, are already making a significant impact. So let's look at what has been happening so far. The first lever is changing chemistries of EV batteries. Today, most EV batteries are lithium-based chemistries, and historically, they also required a lot of nickel and cobalt. But today, in 2024, we are seeing a shift to lithium iron phosphate, which does not require any nickel or cobalt. And if we start looking at the future, we see a BNEF outlook indicates that we will see growing adoption of other alternatives such as sodium ion chemistries that do not require lithium as well. So once we start modeling the impact of these changes into the future, we can see that the demand effectively reduces. For nickel and cobalt, this is almost half in 2050. The second thing is improvements of energy density of batteries. Every new technology is associated with a learning curve. And for batteries, since 2011, we have seen an improvement of 6% in energy density with every cumulative doubling of battery installations. This does include chemistry changes, but we worked to adjust for chemistry change, and then this numbers gets down to 4% of energy density improvements. But this means that we have seen about 25% improvements in just the past decade in terms of mineral needs. And if we model that into the future, we will further limit our need for critical minerals. The third lever that has been in the works is recycling. Researchers from Argonne National Lab and the consulting firm Circular Energy Storage have found that more than half of lithium-ion batteries today are collected for recycling globally. From these collected batteries, we can recover about 80% of lithium and 95% of nickel and cobalt. If you start factoring this into analysis, you can see that your mineral demand effectively starts trending downwards post 2035. This can happen as more and more EVs retire, increasing the recycling feedstocks. So if you start modeling the impact of just these 3 change levers at today's pace, we expect that peak mining demand will occur in 2035, around 2035 for lithium and nickel. And for cobalt, we might actually hit peak demand even before the end of this decade. But we can also look beyond these continued trends and further expand this analysis to consider more solutions and the best case scenario of all of the solutions than just an average estimate. With this, we'll be informed about the full potential benefits, and it will help to define ambitious goals for action. We performed a sensitivity analysis on this full range of solutions and found that the peak time mining demand can move further downwards and forward for these 3 critical minerals. And another way of looking at this, there is a future where we have moved from needing 12 times more minerals than today to a future in which net zero mining demand for lithium, nickel, and cobalt might be possible before 2050. Now, this is an ambitious goal to work towards, and we need strategies to get there. We just saw that circularity, recycling is a key solution lever, but there are many barriers to recycling investments. And prime among them is a lack of clear understanding or clear quantification of the benefits of recycling returns that prevent stakeholders from taking action. Today's supply chain is opaque, fragmented, and has multiple stakeholders, often with competing interests. And that hinders a system level assessment that captures the costs and benefits all along the supply chain. We only look at the standard financial return on investment today, which is looking at the tip of the iceberg. We need to factor in social and environmental returns to arrive at a true cost of extraction and the returns from recycling. And this can be possible by embracing a triple bottom line approach, an approach that values people and the planet alongside profits. With a clear assessment of the costs and holistic returns from recycling, we can identify targeted interventions which can bring this to reality. To have a triple bottom line framework for recycling, we defined 6 impact metrics across 3 dimensions. The financial dimension includes the profit pools from battery recycling. The social metrics include the wages earned and the GDP impact of the jobs created from recycling. The environmental metrics include the reduction in carbon emissions as well as the land use and water use avoided, all of them converted into dollar values. To look at the financial profitability, we relied on Argonne National Lab's Everback model to evaluate a wide range of costs and revenue. The revenue would depend on the residual value of the minerals, which is determined by the battery chemistry composition in the feedstocks and the metal market prices. The costs will depend on economies of scale, utilization of infrastructure, and the upstream design of the battery, which influences how easy or difficult is it to collect, disassemble, and put it through recycling. And by considering this wide-ranging scenarios, we concluded that the business case for recycling is mixed. You can have positive profits of about per ton of recycling about more than $3,000 per ton, or you can also have negative profits amounting to over $1,400 per ton. And the outlook though shifts if we start factoring in the social and environmental returns. This chart shows the cumulative value of the benefits of recycling if all the batteries that are expected to retire in the United States by 2040 are recycled. And the key finding here is that even when profits are negative due to low metal market prices and other factors, the triple bottom line return on investment is overwhelmingly positive. We need to have investment and policy decisions that can help us capture all of this value. To further underscore the need for targeted interventions, we explored a set of case studies focused on lithium extraction and recycling. We focused on lithium because it's the key battery minerals for all EV batteries today and in the near future. And with growing LFP adoption, which we spoke about a few slides ago, we have to plan for lithium extraction and recycling. That's the future. Our baseline analysis will be traditional ore mining, which is a polluting resource-intensive process. And to understand the impact of technological innovation, we consider direct lithium extraction, which sources lithium from brines, and with the use of geothermal energy. And for an accurate comparison, all these 3 cases were considered in the United States. Recycling, unsurprisingly, has an overall positive return when you look at externalities. The social and environmental returns from recycling can be between $170 to $700 per ton of lithium carbonate production, depending on whether you're looking at mining or direct lithium extraction. However, the economics of recycling LFP are challenging. The chart over here shows the profitability of the 3 lithium sourcing processes. And you can see that mining is always more profitable than recycling. And recycling, even when it is making a positive profit margin, will have a harder time attracting investments because mining has higher economic returns on investment. Now, incentives that can de-risk recycling business models. Interventions that can help de-risk recycling business models are needed, and one of them can be policy incentives. So as an example, we consider the impact of Inflation Reduction Act 30D incentives. These incentives are nominally targeted at EV buyers, but since recycled material qualifies as domestic content, which is one of the criteria for availing these incentives, we can consider a portion of this credit could be potentially allocated to recyclers indirectly. So the incentives can amount to over $7,000 per ton of battery. And we allocated only $1,000 in incentives towards recyclers. And we can see by doing so, the profit margin for recycling in a low metal price scenario, which can be around minus 17%, turns positive 6% with this incentives. And this is a profit margin that is enjoyed by recyclers in mature markets today. And it's a great outcome of leveraging some incentives for recycling. So incentives are one of the many ways we can support circular business models. Any intervention that can bring about a demand for recycled products and for responsibly made batteries can help de-risk circularity. And these can be policy incentives such as recycled content mandates, extended producer responsibility, or voluntary measures such as a buyer's alliance to procure responsibly sourced materials or recycled products. So this brings me to the end of my presentation, which was around if we clearly quantify all the possible scenarios, understand our paths, understand our strategy, the costs and benefits of each strategy, we can arrive at identifying targeted interventions that can help build an efficient and a responsible supply chain. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share our work. You can access everything that I just mentioned and a lot more through our website, Battery Circular Economy Initiative at RMI, with this QR code.
Thanks, Sudeshna. We've generated quite a bit of traffic in the Slido. I think the one that's probably the most relevant is for modeling purposes. Sort of, we've got questions on the nuclear side and we have questions on the critical mineral side. And so we'll sort of try and achieve some balance here. Question, in fact, that we've been dealing with in EMH and trying to figure out what to do with. In fact, we have a whole working group trying to think about is the question of what should we do with nuclear in our models, given the uncertainties and knowing that high costs could lead optimization models to exclude it. So what do we do in a modeling context, given those constraints? It's probably mostly to Ramana, although it's possibly a question we're struggling with as well. Oh, we need to use the mic. But I would say it's one that we're open to advice to within EMH as well, because we have a whole working group that's actually thinking about this very question: is what do we do with both nuclear and other things around which there are large uncertainties, and thinking about where do we put them into modeling activities.
Yeah, so I'm not a modeler, so I shouldn't be actually giving advice on what you should be doing in the model. But my general sense is that if you want your models to have some real life sort of relevance in terms of trying to predict outcomes, or at least model outcomes that can realistically be achieved at, you need to start with realistic parameters. I don't think there's any way by which you can magically assume some deflated costs and then you get some answers which look great. I mean, you can reach 1.5 degrees Celsius target at a very nominal cost. But if the cost numbers are really unrealistic, then what's the point of getting that result? So I'm not sure that there's any point in doing that. And yes, I realize that with realistic numbers, nuclear will probably not fit into many of these models. And that's what my general observation has been, that the models that do seem to put in nuclear and saying there's a big role for nuclear typically assume low costs. And so if you were to take that out, then I think we have to ask, this actually opens up a larger question. I mean, in many of these conversations we've been having today, many sort of elephants in the room are sort of being swept aside, right? To mix sort of metaphors outrageously. And so there are larger social and political questions we have to ask. And one of the things which seems to me that many of these energy models are constrained by are ideas about what kind of economic growth is going to happen, what kind of futures are we modeling. And if you assume certain kinds of patterns of growth, then I don't think you will meet climate or any other constraints realistically. And so you have to ask those larger questions. And the energy modeling community, I think, should come out and say, well, I don't think we can meet this, guys. If you have to rethink larger social and political realities. That'd be my take. And I know that that's going to sort of shunt me out of most energy modeling whatever conferences, and that's fine. But maybe Jamie, you have something to say. You have similar questions coming up in the mining context.
Yeah, I think the issue for me is more one of how the different pathways are considered and the extent to which they may actually be mutually contradictory, that resources and attention being paid and measures being put in place towards one set of solutions is actually preventing and becoming an obstacle to other policy directions and other sets of solutions. And so, in this context, if there's a lot of policy attention and money going towards nuclear development that will provide climate solutions in 15 to 20-year horizons, when we need action starting now, addressing that in a different manner and using those resources differently would produce a very different answer.
Next question, again, we'll deal with some of the nuclear stuff and then we'll go on to critical mineral stuff. Question, is it fair to use non-Canadian estimates of cost overruns and time delays for nuclear, given at least some people contend that our experience has been better? I think that would be in the contested facts space, but I think the more specific question is, does it make sense to use non-Canadian reference points when we're talking about nuclear costs?
That's a great question. I don't have a good answer for that, simply because we don't have recent Canadian construction experience. The only experience has been with refurbishing old plants, and there too, the experience has been mixed. I'd point to the case of the reactor in New Brunswick, Point Lepreau, which has been having, was the refurbishment cost much more, and the reactor has been having a lot of trouble. It's been down since April, and the timeline for reopening has been consistently being pushed back. So the question is, what kind of experience are you taking as relevant, and what you're kind of ignoring in that process? And so, yeah, I'll also mention that, the couple of other SMR projects that have been proposed in Canada, there are two companies in New Brunswick, Moltex and ARC, both of which were given millions and millions of dollars by both the provincial and the federal governments. And neither of them actually seems to be on track to building a reactor within the timelines that they promised. And the one other project that was proposed in Chalk River, the micro-modular reactor by Ultrasafe, well, Ultrasafe filed for bankruptcy protection last month. So I don't know what kind of experience you want to sort of talk about. I'll also say one last thing. So the one project that's happening here, of course, is the BWRX 300. And the BWRX 300 is based on a downsizing of a larger project, the ESBWR from GE Hitachi. And there's a lot of sort of paper documentation about its evaluation in the United States. And basically the projects that were proposed were all canceled. They were never constructed. And so if you're going to downsize that, I don't imagine that it's going to be economically better than the larger one. on a per kilowatt hour basis. So again, I don't know what experience you want to sort of talk about when you're talking about the BWRX 300, if there is no existing project anywhere.
I'm gonna switch to critical minerals, and I'm gonna go to the floor. Just a question generally to the panel, but possibly the room, is the extent to which, beyond what we saw from Sudeshna, I mean, are we modeling critical minerals and energy transitions scenarios? And if so, how effectively are their supply chain risks and constraints being addressed? So Jim, did you find sort of modeling in the work that the office was doing there, or on NERCAN's parts or other places? And where are we at on that, I think, is sort of the underlying question.
If you're speaking about on the modeling side,
Yeah.
I think it's still in the early stages. It's something that the department, at least in terms of their approach, that I think it's give them time in terms of working on that approach. But I think some of those uncertainties would have to be, part of that process. That would be my assumption or my understanding.
Jamie, have you seen anything really that try to look at this?
I think my answer would be the same, that it looks to me like Natural Resources Canada is beginning to grapple with this. I haven't seen anything concrete, but at least they're starting to ask the questions.
Sudeshna, have you seen anything internationally on this question in terms of where are we at in the sort of modeling around critical minerals and energy transitions?
I do look up on the work of IEA a little bit to inform some of our analysis, but our analysis goes a little beyond what we have seen so far. That's why we did it. And our founder, Amory Lovins, is a huge proponent of efficiency, and that's often something that is overlooked. So that's what we added onto our analysis, and we are working on building this into a live tool, because we can never come to agreement on perhaps what exactly these levers, what is the exact amount this levers would be, what is the exact value of these inputs. But if we have a live calculator that can inform us, okay, if this happens with efficiency, what is the impact on critical minerals demand? If this happens on the adoption of EVs, what is our impact on critical demand? We need to get there so that we can have a more targeted view on how much investment into mining is exactly needed and when do we start really relying on recycled minerals? When can recycled minerals start playing a role?
Norman.
On the second topic, James McKenzie, I find your report, I mean, Canada is an extractivist country, so we have mines, and your reports essentially, the recommendations are not, I mean, are general. They don't really are relevant for critical minerals. Just, can you manage mining more efficiently? Can you get better environmental assessments and as you go ahead? So am I misunderstanding something?
No, you touched on a good point. And I would say that one of the challenges our office faces is that our role is really to look at the implementation of federal policies, how things are being managed. But there are some, and certainly they came up in some of the presentations today, is that there are alternatives to consider. For example, looking at the role of the automobile and its very dependency. And I think the government's and the government's approach is very much, okay, we're going to continue on. I mean, we can approach the issue of critical minerals and the demands differently by looking at increasing public transit, for example. There are other means of shared transportation. And the commissioner has touched on that, but it's very much those are getting into policy issues. And that's, I would say that's one limitation our office has, is that we typically don't get into policy questions. We look at what the government's set, and then we look at how they're implementing it. But typically, it's really up to the elected officials to set those policies. And our role is really to come in and look at how those policies are being implemented. So our recommendations were very much shaped around what the strategy presented, how it was being managed, as opposed to really challenging, are there different ways of going about it? I think the last presentation was quite interesting in looking at some of the scenarios that could influence, in fact, choices, or not even choices, but policy decisions. And it might take a different approach if we were looking at improving circularity and recycling that could reduce the actual the need for mining. And I think it touches on a broader question that Jamie's touched on, and I know our commissioner has touched on it as well, is the absence of kind of like a broader strategy for the federal government, that there's a critical mineral strategy, and then there's these other strategies, but how do they all line up in terms of a broader kind of industrial energy policy, if you will, for the federal government? So, but that, unfortunately gets into areas that our office typically doesn't comment on in terms of are there alternatives, are there other policy options that we could be approaching or taking on? So I think you're touching on an important point, but it is partly a reflection of some of the limitations that we operate within.
But I would argue that what you're saying here is not really relevant, because Canada is a small player. It doesn't produce these minerals. So if we start with a few mines, it has essentially no impact on how we decide in the US or in Europe or elsewhere how we move the car industry. So in some way, all the strategy of critical minerals in Canada can be looked at in a fairly large leeway, independent of the other choices that you're discussing. So I'm not sure I see the link.
I'm going to throw a related policy question to Deshna, though, because we did talk quite a bit about, you talked quite a bit about recycling EV batteries, and we actually did a study last year on this, and basically discovered that the policy frameworks in North America around EV battery recycling are essentially non-existent. So my question to you then, Deshna, would be, what sorts of policy interventions would need to be made to improve the circularity of the supply chains? They're really essentially to sort of capture the end-of-life EV batteries and be, hopefully achieving some degree of capture in terms of potential recycling of the materials within them.
Sure. I'll answer your question, and I also wanted to address the previous question a little bit about Canada being reliant on extraction of minerals. I think there's a lot of refineries in Canada for nickel. I think there's an increasing investment in lithium. And one of the things that we found in our research is that the recycling technologies have a huge overlap with the refining technologies as well. So we need refining capacity anyhow. We anyhow need to scale refining capacity to meet the mineral demand in this first decade to build our batteries, and then these same facilities could be used to recycle materials as well. And there are some, I forget the names, but there are some refiners who are already doing recycling to some extent in their facilities already. And there are investments into startups that look at energy transition minerals, that at tech startups which have the technology to both be a refiner and a recycler. So technologies such as this in a country which has raw material reserves, these are some of the strategic investments that can be made for the future, and these should be encouraged. Coming to your question, Mark, on what are you're right to say that North America does not have a lot of policies around encouraging recycling, though 30D, I consider that as kind of supportive of recycling because it can help reduce the profit gap that we saw a little bit, and that requirement to have domestic content is a key lever that can be put to have to support domestic recycling. Other policies there are good example of what policy levers can help, and the EU battery regulation actually has this holistic framework of what can be done to enable a circular economy. The first is a clear requirement of what should be happening to end of life batteries. So if you know that batteries cannot end up being just discarded and need to be repurposed or recycled, that helps encourage investments, R&D efforts. You also need traceability requirements. You cannot manage what you cannot measure. So you need to know the provenance of battery, what materials you are getting, and how you are handling them at risk, whether it's getting back to the supply chain at the end of life or not. So these are two key policy levers that can help. And then the reason why governments should be interested in doing this is because you have a huge economic development benefit. You will have jobs. Recycling can happen in any part of the globe, and it needs to happen in every part of the globe. So each country can benefit from economic development. Each country can benefit from having energy security. You do not have to import minerals. You do not have to be reliant on other countries for meeting your energy needs.
Thank you. There's a whole bunch of nuclear questions. I think we're going to have to leave those for lunch about optimization. Because my last question I'm actually going to put to Jim, because in fact we were trying to get the commissioner to be one of our speakers here, and the question we were going to put to him is one that we've got on the traffic here, which is you're the substitute for now. Is what role can the commissioner's office play in ensuring the quality and transparency of models and their outputs in Canada's policymaking process?
So thanks for the question. And it's getting into some of the work that the Commissioner has been doing on the Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act. And if you look at some of our reports, we do have findings and observations in there around modeling and estimations with respect to, for example, some of the GHG or estimated GHG reductions for specific measures that the federal government has got in place, and there's dozens and dozens of measures. And so we are, as an office, that is one role that we're playing, is looking at not only the implementation of those measures, but how, I guess, reliable and complete are the estimates and the modeling that's taking place behind some of those, or that not behind, but that are related to those measures. So that's probably the most direct response, is that the requirement to monitor the net zero emissions accountability, or the act, and looking at what the federal government is doing in that space, so to speak.
Very good, thank you. I think we've got a whole pile of questions here, but I think the clock has become our enemy here, and we're keeping people from lunch as well. So I think at this stage we just need to thank our speakers for these excellent presentations. And we can continue the conversations over lunch. Okay?